"That's enough," the words cracked like a gavel slamming in a silent courtroom, but they didn't come from the chair. They came from Bill Barr, his face flushed, his voice rising with the sharp edge of authority turned into a weapon. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Conversations halted. Pens froze in midair. Every eye in the chamber darted toward the towering figure who had just erupted. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat still, her pen resting lightly on her notes, her expression unreadable. The contrast was jarring, Barr seething, Crockett composed. The imbalance of power, the arrogance of his outburst was undeniable. But so too was the weight of what had just unfolded. Cameras clicked. Flashes went off like a staccato drumbeat, capturing the frozen tableau. Journalists scribbled, their brows raised. Staffers exchanged glances that said everything without a word. Did that really just happen? Even the members seated on either side shifted uncomfortably, as though Barr's thunderclap had shaken something sacred. And then came the silence. Not the ordinary pause of a meeting, but the kind of silence that thickens the air, that makes you feel like you're breathing history itself. It wasn't just that Barr had lost his temper, it was that he had done so in the most public, unguarded way possible, against the very person who embodied what he underestimated. What followed was not immediate retaliation. Crockett did not rush, did not raise her voice. She simply looked back at Barr, her calm gaze slicing through his storm louder than any shout could. In that moment the room tilted. The audience, those inside the chamber and those who would soon watch the clip, felt a shift they couldn't yet put into words. Because this wasn't just another outburst in Washington. This was a rupture, a mask slipping, a powerful man revealing his fear of being cornered by truth. And it was more than a fight between two people. It was a collision of two Americas, one clinging to arrogance and old power, the other rising with dignity and unshakable resolve. What happened next would not just silence Bill Barr. It would set the internet ablaze, redefine the stakes of the hearing, and leave a nation asking, who really had enough? The hearing had already carried the heavy weight of expectation. A former attorney general sitting across from a freshman congresswoman, on paper the odds were lopsided. Barr had spent decades navigating these halls of power, a man comfortable with stonewalling, with sidestepping uncomfortable truths. He had worn his ability to dodge accountability like armor. To him, this chamber was familiar ground. To him, a sharp rebuke, even a shouted command, was nothing more than another tool in his arsenal. But this wasn't just another procedural skirmish. The air was charged with the question that lingered beneath every exchange, truth versus deflection. Crockett pressed for clarity, for answers, for the simple dignity of being heard. Barr, as always, danced around the substance. He shifted, he redirected, he leaned on the authority of his stature to turn questions into lectures. It was a performance he had perfected, until that single slip of temper betrayed something deeper. Because hearings are never just hearings. They are theatre, yes, but they are also a stage where symbols are forged. And on this stage, the image of a powerful white man shouting down a black woman was not lost on anyone. It evoked a history older than the chamber itself, centuries of dismissal, of silencing, of authority wielded to stifle rather than to answer. For some watching, it was infuriatingly familiar. For others, it was a revelation. Crockett's presence in that room meant more than her questions. She represented millions who had been told, "That's enough," in classrooms, in workplaces, in courtrooms, those whose voices were treated as interruptions rather than contributions. And Barr, whether he realized it or not, had crystallized that struggle into one unforgettable moment. The stakes were no longer about the technicalities of policy. They were about dignity, identity, and who gets to claim the microphone in America's most powerful spaces. The clip of his outburst was already being replayed in the minds of those present, a viral moment in the making. Everyone knew the cameras had caught it, and soon the country would see what happens when power grows impatient with accountability. And yet Barr made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed that raising his voice would end the exchange. He believed that authority, when shouted loudly enough, would close the chapter. What he did not understand was the quiet resolve sitting across from him. Jasmine Crockett was not rattled. She was not diminished. If anything, Barr's eruption had set the stage for her to do what so few had managed before, to turn his own force against him. In that chamber, the imbalance of power seemed overwhelming. Barr had decades of experience, a lifetime of connections, and the unshakable arrogance of someone who had always been insulated from consequence. But Crockett carried something different, something Barr couldn't see until it was too late. She carried the unyielding patience of those who fight not for themselves alone, but for everyone who has been silenced. The silence after his outburst was not an ending. It was the inhale before a storm. The audience leaned in, sensing what was coming. For the first time, Barr looked less like a master of the room and more like a man whose grip was slipping. Because here was the truth: power can shout, but dignity doesn't flinch. And Barr, for all his years in Washington, had just underestimated the woman sitting across from him. To understand the weight of Barr's outburst, you have to understand the man himself. William Barr is not some impulsive backbencher or nervous bureaucrat. He is a creature of Washington's deepest corridors, a man who has spent decades mastering the art of power not through inspiration, but through obstruction. To those who know his record, the moment he barked at Jasmine Crockett was less a surprise than the inevitable culmination of a career, built on shutting down voices that dared to pierce the armor of authority. Barr first rose to prominence in the early 1990s, serving as Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush. Even then, his instincts were clear. He was the lawyer who believed the executive branch should wield near-limitless power, who saw oversight as a nuisance, and who treated Congress not as a co-equal branch of government, but as an annoyance to be managed. In his worldview, presidents were kings in all but name, and he was their loyal steward. When Donald Trump brought him back to the Department of Justice decades later, those instincts found their perfect stage. Barr wasn't just an attorney general, he became the shield behind which a president could do as he pleased. Investigations were deflected, inconvenient truths buried. Scandals reframed. Barr had no patience for transparency and no hesitation in using his position to tilt the scales. He wasn't merely a lawyer, he was a fixer, a strategist who knew that in Washington, survival isn't about honesty, it's about control. And control was his specialty. When witnesses pressed for details, he filibustered with legal jargon. When lawmakers demanded answers, he gave them rehearsed evasions. He knew the procedural tricks, the loopholes, the ways to drown truth in a sea of technicalities. Each appearance before Congress became less about democratic accountability and more about a performance of arrogance, an untouchable man smirking at those who dared to challenge him. It was this arrogance, this unshakable belief that no one could corner him, that colored every moment of his second tenure. He had weathered scandal after scandal. He had tilted investigations, issued misleading summaries, and defended the indefensible. And through it all, he remained insulated, cocooned by decades of elite connections and the confidence that he could not be touched. So when Barr sat across from Jasmine Crockett, he carried with him not just his experience but his entitlement. In his mind, this was just another congressional hearing. He had sparred with senators, he had outlasted critics, he had stared down the press and come out smirking. What was one more representative with sharp questions? To him it was routine. He would deflect, grow impatient, assert dominance and move on. But therein lies the flaw. Arrogance creates blind spots. For all his years of maneuvering, Barr had underestimated how the optics had changed. America was no longer content with the old show of power. The viral age meant that every sneer, every raised voice, every dismissive wave of the hand could be clipped, shared, dissected, and replayed to millions. And when the person on the receiving end of that arrogance was not another Washington insider, but a young black congresswoman, the stakes were transformed. Barr thought his reputation made him untouchable, but reputations can crumble in a single moment. To the millions who would soon watch the clip of his outburst, Barr didn't look like a titan of the law. He looked like a bully cornered by questions he couldn't swat away. He didn't look powerful, he looked exposed. For decades he had honed the image of the consummate insider, the man who could bend institutions to his will. But in this chamber, in this exchange, his greatest weapon, his confidence, was about to betray him, because arrogance has a way of blinding men to the dangers right in front of them. Barr had faced senators, presidents, and journalists, but he had never faced Jasmine Crockett. And unlike all the others, she wasn't interested in playing his game. She wasn't there to be silenced, or to be lectured, or to be intimidated into submission. She was there for something far greater, for truth, for dignity, for everyone who had ever been told that's enough when they dared to speak. Barr didn't see it yet, but history would. Because arrogance always leaves blind spots, and Crockett was ready. Long before she ever sat across from Bill Barr, Jasmine Crockett had been sharpening her voice in the crucible of struggle. Her story wasn't one of privilege or easy entry into politics. It was the story of a woman who had to fight for every inch of ground she gained. To understand the power of her calm that day, you have to understand the storms she had already weathered. Crockett's roots run deep in the soil of resilience. She came of age not in the gilded corridors of Washington, but in communities where the law was not an abstract principle but a daily battleground. From the start, she carried with her an awareness of injustice, not as theory but as lived reality. While others saw politics as a game of titles and positions, she saw it as a fight for dignity, for survival, for voices too often ignored. Before Congress, she was an attorney, and in the courtroom she learned quickly what it meant to be underestimated. Judges interrupted her. Opposing counsel rolled their eyes. Juries sometimes looked surprised that this young black woman stood at the front table arguing cases with the confidence of someone twice her age. But Crockett didn't flinch. Every interruption was fuel. Every dismissal became another stone in the foundation of her resolve. She wasn't the lawyer who spoke the loudest, she was the lawyer who cut the deepest. Her questions landed like scalpels, precise and undeniable. And when others tried to drown her out, she learned the art of silence, the power of waiting, of letting the weight of her words hang heavy until no one could look away. That courtroom patience became one of her greatest weapons. Her path into politics was no smoother. When she stepped into the arena, critics dismissed her as inexperienced, as too brash, as someone who didn't fit the mold of what a congresswoman should look like. They underestimated her fire, her intellect, her ability to connect the dots between everyday struggles and the lofty debates of Washington. They underestimated how deeply she carried the stories of those who sent her to the Capitol, the single mother fighting eviction, the young man facing a system stacked against him, the immigrant worker who felt invisible. What fueled her wasn't ambition for its own sake, it was representation. Crockett knew what it was to be silenced. She knew the weight of the word, enough, when spoken not as compromise but as dismissal. And she carried with her a determination that no one else should have to swallow their truth simply because power found it inconvenient. That is why when she entered Congress she did not come quietly. She came with the same energy she had carried in the courtroom, fearless, unbothered by titles, unwilling to accept half-truths. Her speeches cut through noise. Her questions in hearings landed like thunderclaps. She did not waste words and she did not play games. And yet her power was not in bluster, it was in authenticity. For every viewer watching her there was something deeply relatable in her presence. She was not born into a dynasty, she had not been groomed in the halls of Ivy League privilege. She was a fighter, molded by the same dismissals and underestimations that so many in America had faced. When she spoke, it wasn't just her story, it was theirs. This is what made her clash with Barr so potent. On one side sat a man who had spent decades cocooned in power, insulated by privilege, confident that authority alone could shield him. On the other sat Crockett, whose entire life had been a confrontation with those who told her she didn't belong. She had survived that chorus before, and each time she had answered not with retreat, but with resolve. Every courtroom battle, every time she was cut off mid-sentence, every time someone raised their voice to silence her, it all led to this moment. Each dismissal had been practice. Each interruption had been training. Each underestimation had prepared her to face one of Washington's most arrogant figures and not just hold her ground, but command it. For the audience watching, this wasn't abstract. It wasn't politics in the detached sense. It was personal. It was every meeting where they'd been talked over, every job where their contributions had been minimized, every classroom where their questions had been brushed aside. Crockett's presence in that chamber was a mirror. She stood for everyone who had ever been told to shrink, and she stood tall. So when Barr exploded with his thunderous "That's enough," he was not simply shouting at Jasmine Crockett. He was shouting at all the voices that had risen from the margins to the center. He was shouting at a history that refused to remain silent. And Crockett, through the stillness of her composure, carried not only her own dignity, but the dignity of millions. Her journey had been one long preparation for this exact clash. Not by design, but by necessity. And though Barr believed he could end the exchange with volume, he had no idea that the woman seated across from him was built from the echoes of 1,000 silenced voices, voices that would not fade this time. Every courtroom battle, every struggle, every dismissal, every interruption, all of it had prepared Jasmine Crockett for this exact moment. The clash did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. At first the questions seemed ordinary, Jasmine Crockett, measured and deliberate, reading directly from her notes. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't grandstanding for the cameras. She was doing what Barr despised most, pressing with precision, boxing him in with facts that offered him no escape. "Mr. Barr," she began, her tone steady, "you've claimed repeatedly that your actions were guided by the law. Yet the record shows clear inconsistencies. Can you explain why your statements differ from the documented timeline?" Barr leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. He gave a half-smile, the kind he often used as armor. "Congresswoman, I think you misunderstand the context." But Crockett cut through his fog with another sharp strike. "No, sir, the context is clear. The question is why your words don't match the facts. Which is it? Were you mistaken, or were you misleading the American people?" The room shifted, murmurs, pens scratching faster. Barr's smile tightened. He cleared his throat, leaned forward and began to lecture as if a longer sentence could obscure a direct answer. Yet Crockett was unrelenting. Each time he tried to expand, she interrupted, not rudely but firmly, reclaiming the floor that was hers. "Reclaiming my time," she said, the phrase sharp and decisive, a reminder that his evasions wouldn't work here. With each exchange, Barr's veneer cracked further. He shifted in his chair, his voice grew louder, his tone sharper. "Congresswoman, you are mischaracterizing." But Crockett didn't flinch, she pressed harder. "Sir, I'm quoting your own words. Are you suggesting your statements are unreliable?" That line landed. Even members sitting silently began to lean in, sensing the unraveling. Barr's hands gripped the table, his face flushed. The old tricks weren't working. He wasn't dictating the pace, she was. The tension was electric, every second charged with the sense that something was about to break. Barr, so accustomed to controlling the room, now looked cornered. Each dodge met with a fact, each deflection met with firmness. Crockett wasn't just questioning him, she was dismantling him piece by piece, and the audience could feel it. The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing the beads of sweat forming at Barr's temple, the steady gaze of Crockett across from him. Social media interns in the press gallery already had their phones out, ready to clip the fireworks they sensed were about to erupt. And Barr felt it too. The tightening noose of facts, the loss of control, the indignity of being pinned down by someone he believed he could easily dismiss. His sentences grew shorter, his tone more brittle. Finally, Crockett delivered the line that cut deepest. "Mr. Barr, with all due respect, the American people deserve the truth. Not diversions, not lectures, just truth." There was a pause, the kind of pause that swells like a drumbeat. Barr's jaw clenched. His hands trembled slightly on the table, and in that pause you could feel the dam straining. Then, like a thunderclap, it came. His voice boomed across the chamber, raw, unfiltered, dripping with rage and wounded pride. "That's enough." The words shattered the tension like glass. Gasps rippled through the room. Some froze in disbelief, others exchanged stunned glances. Reporters' pens scribbled furiously, capturing the outburst that would soon headline every clip. And there, in the stillness that followed, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply looked back at Barr with calm that cut sharper than any retort. The storm had broken, but its target was not rattled. And then he snapped. The echo of Barr's outburst hung in the chamber like smoke after an explosion. "That's enough." The words had ricocheted off marble walls and into the veins of everyone present, jarring the stillness with raw force. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence afterward was heavier than the shout itself, pressing down on the room until you could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the audience. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, she didn't recoil. She didn't let her pen slip from her hand or her gaze falter. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch. She let Barr's eruption hang in the air like an indictment against himself. While others shifted uncomfortably, she sat perfectly still, calm and unshaken, the eye of the storm. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, not meek but measured. Each syllable deliberate, each word cutting sharper than the shout that had preceded it. "Mr. Barr," she began, her tone steady, "with all due respect, shouting down questions is not the same as answering them." The room stirred, murmurs rippled across the gallery, a few heads tilted upward, eyebrows raised, reporters' pens scratched faster. The contrast was undeniable, Barr's fury against Crockett's poise, one man raging, the other personifying restraint. Barr shifted in his chair, his face still flushed, his breathing heavier than before. He opened his mouth to retort, but Crockett pressed on, refusing to yield the floor. "You say that's enough," she continued, her gaze fixed directly on him, unwavering. "But the American people haven't had enough. They haven't had enough of evasions. They haven't had enough of contradictions. And they certainly haven't had enough of powerful men treating accountability as an inconvenience." The words landed like hammer strikes. Each sentence heavier than the last, each one pushing Barr further into the corner he had built for himself. Across the chamber, a few members shifted in their seats, some nodding almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of moment when truth sliced through the fog of procedure, when the weight of history felt palpable in the room. Barr tried to regain footing. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice trembling just slightly with restrained anger. But Crockett raised her hand not rudely but firmly, reclaiming her time. Her voice remained calm, but her cadence quickened just enough to sharpen the tension. "You've told this committee one story, yet the documents tell another. When pressed, you retreat into lectures. When cornered by facts, you raise your voice. That may have worked in the past, but it won't work here, not today." The chamber grew still again, the audience holding its breath. Every eye was on Barr, but it was Crockett who commanded the room. Her presence had expanded beyond her chair, filling every corner with a dignity that no amount of shouting could diminish. Barr leaned forward, gripping the microphone as if proximity could restore his control. But his words faltered. The bravado that had once carried him through hearings now rang hollow against Crockett's calm. He tried to begin another defense, but Crockett cut him short with precision. "You've had enough time, sir," she said, her voice rising only slightly. "Just enough to claim authority. Now the country deserves answers." It was devastating. The air cracked with the weight of her statement. The murmurs returned, this time louder, charged with disbelief at the reversal unfolding before them. Barr, the man who had weathered scandal after scandal, who had silenced critics with smirks and evasions, was suddenly on the defensive, stripped of his armor. Crockett leaned back slightly, not triumphant but resolute. Her calm presence magnified the humiliation already washing over Barr. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need theatrics. Her very composure exposed the fragility of his authority. Every fact she invoked landed with surgical precision. She recited his prior testimony, quoted the timelines, referenced the documents, each one pulling the rug further from under him. It was less a debate than a dismantling, brick by brick, until the edifice of arrogance collapsed under the weight of truth. The crowd reaction was unmistakable. Gasps when she quoted him back to himself. Nervous chuckles when she brushed aside his attempts to deflect. Murmurs of wow when she reframed his authority as weakness. The hearing room was no longer neutral ground. It had become her stage, and Barr was simply the foil against which her strength shone brighter. And Barr felt it. His posture slumped, his retorts grew shorter, his voice carried less command. For a man so accustomed to dictating the terms, it was the unfamiliar territory of being outmatched, not by louder volume but by unshakable poise. Crockett pressed one final point, her tone calm but piercing. "You may declare that's enough, Mr. Barr, but accountability doesn't end when you say so. It ends when the truth is told." The sentence landed like a final blow, echoing in the chamber. Reporters' heads jerked up. Pens scribbled furiously. Even some of Barr's allies avoided his gaze. And then came the silence. That same heavy silence that had followed his outburst, only now the balance had shifted. Barr sat there, lips parted, searching for a reply that wouldn't come. For once in his long career, William Barr, the man who had faced presidents and outlasted critics, was without words. For a moment, even Barr was speechless. The silence in the chamber didn't last long. By the time the hearing adjourned, phones were already buzzing, cameras already uploading, tweets already firing into the digital bloodstream. What had happened inside that committee room wasn't going to stay there. It was too explosive, too raw, too symbolic to be confined by marble walls. Within minutes the clip surfaced online, Barr shouting "That's enough," only to be met with Crockett's calm, devastating counter. It spread like wildfire, shared, reposted, remixed. On Twitter hashtags began climbing. "That's enough, Crockett vs Barr, accountability now." By the hour's end, Crockett's name was trending in multiple cities. The internet devoured it. People replayed the clip on loop, the juxtaposition mesmerizing, Barr's red-faced eruption and Crockett's serene dismantling. Memes exploded overnight. One split-screen image showed Barr shouting on one side, Crockett calmly sipping water on the other, captioned, "Volume not equal to victory." Another turned her line, "You may declare that's enough, but accountability doesn't end when you say so," into a rallying cry splashed across protest posters and TikTok edits. Commentators jumped in almost instantly. Cable news anchors replayed the moment with astonishment. Progressive voices framed it as a symbol of courage in the face of bullying. Even skeptical pundits had to admit, Crockett had seized control of the narrative with surgical precision. The usually cautious editorial pages marveled at her composure, one headline blaring, "Calm dignity silences shouting Barr." Late-night comedians wasted no time. On monologues coast to coast, They mocked Barr's eruption with exaggerated impressions and then highlighted Crockett's icy calm. Laughter spread, but beneath it was a deeper resonance, the universal satisfaction of watching arrogance punctured and dignity prevail. And the ripple effects weren't just cultural, they were political. Crockett's fundraising page saw a sudden surge. New followers flocked to her social media accounts, praising her strength, her poise, her refusal to be silenced. For many, she wasn't just a politician anymore, she was a symbol. A woman of color, dismissed and underestimated, standing unshaken before a powerful man who thought raising his voice would end the conversation. Barr, meanwhile, found himself recast. For years he had cultivated an image of unflappable control, a lawyer's lawyer who knew how to navigate the murky waters of Washington power. But now the image burned into the public consciousness was different. A man rattled, shouting at a younger, sharper challenger, and losing. The arrogance that once shielded him now looked like weakness exposed. Opinion writers didn't miss the symbolism. One column read, "What we witnessed was bigger than one exchange, it was a collision of eras." Barr represented the old guard, entrenched, defensive, dismissive. Crockett represented the new, confident, unapologetic, unwilling to be silenced. That framing resonated. Across communities, people said they saw themselves in her, women who had been talked over in boardrooms, immigrants who had been dismissed in meetings, young activists told to wait their turn. The moment wasn't just politics, it was personal. Crockett had become their avatar in that hearing room, standing firm where so many had been steamrolled. The validation poured in. "This is what courage looks like," one viral tweet read, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another simply said, "She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for all of us." Even those who hadn't followed politics closely were drawn in. The clip had that rare quality, a distilled drama that told a bigger truth in seconds. It didn't need background, didn't need context. Anyone could watch and instantly understand who was who, what was at stake, and why it mattered. And so Crockett's stature grew. She wasn't just the congresswoman from Texas anymore. She was the woman who stood her ground, who refused to be silenced, who embodied the power of calm in the face of rage. Her voice carried further, her platform widened, her influence deepened. Meanwhile, Barr tried to move past the incident, but the internet has no mercy for viral humiliation. Clips of his outburst were set to music, edited into parodies, endlessly recirculated. The more he tried to project authority, the more people remembered that one moment when authority cracked and dignity shone brighter. The power imbalance that once seemed insurmountable had flipped on its head. Crockett, underestimated, interrupted, dismissed, now stood as a rising star. Barr, who had strutted with untouchable confidence, now wore the mantle of exposed bully. The aftermath wasn't just about one hearing or one headline. It was about what people everywhere felt watching it. A reminder that calm can disarm rage, that truth can outlast arrogance, that dignity can silence even the loudest shout. And for millions who had felt voiceless, Jasmine Crockett's voice became their own. In the days that followed, as the viral storm settled into the fabric of national conversation, a deeper truth began to crystallize. The exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Bill Barr wasn't remembered for the heat of Barr's shout. It was remembered for the steadiness of Crockett's calm. For the way she didn't flinch, didn't mirror his anger, didn't let his outburst dictate the moment. Instead, she transformed it. Her restraint told a story more powerful than any headline. Dignity over arrogance, calm over shouting, truth over power. That was the lesson that replayed in living rooms, classrooms, and community halls across the country. People weren't quoting Barr's words, they were quoting hers. They weren't impressed by his bluster, they were inspired by her composure. And that mattered. Because for so long, politics has often rewarded the loudest voice, the harshest insult, the sharpest put-down. But Crockett revealed something timeless. Volume is not strength. Real strength is the ability to remain steady when others are shaking, to stay grounded when others are flailing, to wield facts and truth as a sharper weapon than any raised voice could ever be. Her moment in that chamber wasn't just a takedown, it was a lesson in courage. Courage that doesn't need theatrics. Courage that doesn't bow to intimidation. Courage that shows its face in the quiet but unshakable insistence on truth. And so the story transcended the individuals. It was no longer just Crockett versus Barr, it became about all of us. Every person who has ever been told to be quiet, every woman talked over in a meeting, every immigrant dismissed in a conversation, every young person underestimated by someone older and louder. Crockett's calm wasn't just her own, it was a mirror in which millions saw themselves, finally standing tall. The moral clarity was undeniable. Arrogance shouts but dignity echoes, shouting fades but truth lingers. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the loudest truth. That is why this moment won't fade into obscurity. It will be replayed not because of Barr's anger, but because of Crockett's calm. Not because of humiliation, but because of inspiration. It showed us that history doesn't always bend toward the ones who speak the loudest. It bends toward the ones who speak with clarity, composure, and conviction. In that sense, Jasmine Crockett's stand was more than a viral clip. It was a reminder of what we can be when we refuse to be silenced. It was proof that dignity can still win in a culture obsessed with noise. And it was a challenge, to every viewer, every citizen, every voice, that the same courage lives within us. Because the truth is simple. We don't all have the power of a gavel or the title of Attorney General or the platform of Congress. But we all have a voice. And the way we use it, the way we hold it steady in the face of arrogance, can shape not only our own lives but the lives of others watching. Jasmine Crockett showed us that power is not about volume, it's about conviction. It's not about silencing, it's about refusing to be silenced. And in that moment her calm revealed something universal. The strength to speak truth to power belongs to all of us. For some it was just a hearing. For others it was history. But for everyone who felt the weight of her words, it was a spark. A reminder that no shout, no dismissal, no attempt to silence can stand against dignity rooted in truth. And in that spark, the moral became clear. Sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one history remembers. Bill Barr may have yelled, his voice echoing across the chamber in a desperate attempt to seize control. But in the end, it wasn't his thunder that people remembered. It was Jasmine Crockett's silence, her composure, her steady gaze that left him and much of America speechless. The title of this story writes itself. Barr shouted, but Crockett stood taller. And that is the moral clarity we take away. Arrogance always crumbles under the weight of dignity. Shouting may dominate a moment, but truth dominates history. Crockett showed us that power doesn't belong to the loudest person at the table. It belongs to the one who refuses to be shaken, who trusts that calm conviction carries further than any outburst ever could. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a reminder of what still matters: accountability, courage, and the unyielding belief that truth cannot be silenced. Crockett reminded us that even in an age of noise, the voice of dignity can cut through louder than any shout. And now the question turns to you. If you believe truth still matters, if you believe dignity deserves to stand above arrogance, if you believe these moments must not fade into silence, then share this video. Let others see it. Subscribe for more battles America cannot afford to ignore, because these stories are not just about politics, they are about who we are and who we can still be. Because history doesn't remember the loudest man in the room, it remembers the one who stood tallest in silence. And on that day, it was Jasmine Crockett who stood tallest.